Good morning. This is Ron. It is Tuesday, April the 10th. Welcome to Story Time. Today, continuing with Chapter 13, The Stimulus and the Response from Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? It's a chapter that is divided up into two sections. First section is the stimulus, and the second section is the response. And today we're going to start with the response. It'll be part one of the response. Quote, the attention lavished on Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner and his new book has been nothing short of remarkable, unquote, states the New York Times Book Review, October 24, 1971, in a special box on its front page. After citing a long list of Mr. Skinner's press interviews and television appearances, the statement continues, quote, the American Psychological Association gave him its annual award in September and hailed him as a pioneer in psychological research, leader in theory, master in technology, who has revolutionized the study of behavior in our time, a superlative scholar, scientist, teacher, and writer, unquote. And by the way, I wanted to say that, of course, the previous episodes on this chapter have been dealing with the stimulus, and the stimulus is basically Ayn Rand's review of B.F. Skinner's book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And so now this is her response. Bear in mind the fact that the above testimonial is given to a theoretician whose theory consists of proclaiming that man is a mindless automaton, to a technologist whose technology consists in urging people to accept totalitarian control, to a scholar who substitutes the oldest of old wives' tales for a knowledge of philosophy, to a scientist who commits the kinds of logical fallacies for which a freshman would be flunked. It would be unfair to assume that the testimonial represents the intellectual level of the entire psychological profession. Obviously, it does not, and we all know how such testimonials, or resolutions or protests, are put over by a special clique on a busy, confused, indifferent majority. But which is worse, a profession that actually subscribes to that testimonial, or a profession that does not, yet permits this sort of thing to be issued in its name? I think the latter is worse. Manipulators, such as Mr. Skinner's clique, do not seek to persuade, but to put something over on people. The fact that Mr. Skinner got away with the mere title of the book, let alone its thesis, indicates that the cultural field is empty, that no serious opposition is to be expected, that anything goes. To be exact, I would say not quite anything and not quite yet, but the cultural prognosis is pretty bleak. Mr. Skinner's trial balloon has been punctured by many different people, including some able sharpshooters, but if he studies the shreds, he will notice that only buckshot was used. The book deserves no heavier ammunition, but its thesis does. With a few exceptions, the superlatives hailing the book's importance came from press agents or blurb writers, not from reviewers. Most of the reviews were mixed or negative. As a whole, they conveyed an odd feeling, not the violence of a storm, but the sadness of a steady drizzle, as if exhausted men were still unable to accept the evil brazenly offered to them for appraisal, but unable, without knowing why, their resources long since forgotten, moved by some remnant of decency as by a faint echo from a very distant past. What deserved a scream of indignation was received with a sigh. The two best, i.e., thoroughly unfavorable, reviews appear in the New York Republic and the New York Review of Books. The rest of them attack Mr. Skinner but concede his case. They accept him as an exponent of reason and science and seize the opportunity to damn reason and science. The review in the New Republic, October 16, 1971, is quietly firm and civilized. Its primary target is Mr. Skinner's and behaviorism's view of man, which it describes as psychology without a psyche. As an example of its approach, Skinner's argument, quote, goes like this. Physics used to attribute human characteristics to physical objects, such as growing more jubilant as they approached their natural places. Only when it stopped this did scientific progress follow. Would not scientific progress follow in psychology if we would stop attributing human characteristics to human beings? He does not naturally put it quite in those terms, but I've given the structural essence of the matter, unquote. As an example of its appraisal of other aspects, quote, the argumentation is often sloppy, the sensibility often Philistine, the language often eccentric, unquote, as an apparent rebuke for Mr. Skinner's expression, quote, inside man's skin, unquote. Quote, and something inside my skull is reluctant to accept the simple, unproblematic world that Skinner offers, not just because it doesn't like it, but because it thinks it all wrong for people whose skulls contain similar complex apparatus, unquote. In all the reviews I read, this is the only passage that defends intelligence. A cautious little piece in the Saturday Review, October 9, 1971, praises the book for the following. Quote, first of all, Dr. Skinner pays admirable attention to social problems. Skinner's sharp critique of punishment as a largely ineffectual control is pertinent to the pressing question of prisons, unquote. In the context of the profound philosophical fundamentals that Mr. Skinner challenges, this sort of comment cannot even be classified as journalistic or range of the moment. This is range of the split second, after which the reviewer proceeds gently to blame Mr. Skinner for, quote, his lust to objectivize everything, unquote. Thus, he complains destroys the, quote, mystery of man, unquote. Therefore, he concludes placatingly, quote, another dream of reason has ended as a nightmare of an eminent psychologist, in this case perhaps the most influential of living American psychologists. But was it a good dream to begin with? Was it even especially rational one? I.e., is it rational to use reason? We all know some of the devastating results of following the old imperative to control and subdue nature outside man, of adopting the dictum of Skinner's spiritual forebear, Francis Bacon, that, quote, knowledge is power, unquote. Are we about to try the same experiment with, quote, manipulable man, unquote? This means that Mr. Skinner is a man of reason and a great scientist whose theory would lead us to triumphs as brilliant as those achieved by physical sciences, but we must not try it. The reviewer concludes sweetly. Quote, this only if the views of this book are for the most part rejected will it really have a good effect on the social environment, unquote. I suppose on prison reform. This sort of mealy-mouthed insult is unfair to any book, even Mr. Skinner's. The review in Psychotherapy and Social Science Review, January 1972, is of a much higher caliber. It blasts many aspects of Mr. Skinner's notions competently and effectively, then blasts itself by the following indications of its own viewpoint. Quote, but what in individual terms may be a struggle between narcissism and objective love, between indulgence in self and love of others, in societal terms becomes a struggle between anarchy and over-control. It is hard to know what the remedy should be, unquote. The reviewer mentions, quote, the vicissitudes of personal and social superego, unquote, and, quote, the struggle or the slowly accumulating evidence that man will always have to struggle with his dual and decisive nature, unquote, which consists of the capacity to think and to feel. He concludes, quote, to pursue the last path, to attempt to turn pure instinct into pure reason is to fly in the face of the ambivalent nature of man, unquote. This means that Mr. Skinner is an advocate or representative of pure reason. And, quote, perhaps to be able to face these unresolvable dilemmas and painful paradoxes without recourse to either impotence or grandiosity may finally deserve the name of dignity, unquote. If behaviorism declares, through Mr. Skinner, quote, I can resolve anything somehow, unquote, and its major rival school of psychology, Freudianism, advises, quote, resign yourself to unresolvable dilemmas, unquote, behaviorism will win. The review in The Atlantic, October 1971, is a peculiar mixture. The reviewer properly condemns Mr. Skinner for his, quote, love of power over others, unquote. He attacks Mr. Skinner on a crucial issue, the destruction of language and therefore of judgment. But observe the following statement, quote, "Let us be clear, it is not the sublime dumbness of mysticism toward which Mr. Skinner's idealism moves. It is rather closer to the societies of 1984 and their newspeak, the atrophy of consciousness through the shriveling of language," unquote. In his best paragraph, the reviewer states that Skinner's, quote, "own gospel of environmental determinism is one of the most serious threats conceivable to human survival. By eroding the sense of responsibility, it licenses people to shift the blame from themselves to, quote, the system," unquote. It provides universal exoneration for atrocity after atrocity or for compliance after compliance. It works to increase the amount of evil in the world, unquote. This is eminently true, but a few paragraphs earlier, the reviewer said, quote, "Determinism may be true, false, or both, but whatever it is, if it's used as Skinner uses it, the doom of conscious life is announced," unquote. How else can determinism, quote, "be used," unquote? If a man cannot help what he does, how can he be held responsible for it? And if a given idea could be true, false, or both at the same time and in the same respect, what sort of conscious life would be possible? The mystery of the reviewer's stand is solved in his last paragraph. Quote, "Skinner believes that we can survive only if we allow a gigantic simplification of life. By that he must finally mean the atrophy of consciousness. He does not think that the introspective, complex, self-doubting, self-torturing, self-indulgent, dissident, worldly people are efficient. He can set things up, he is sure, so that fewer such people occur. Does he not see that only silly geese lay golden eggs? This means," unquote. "This means Mr. Skinner represents reason, order, efficiency, but it is the emotion-ridden, contradiction-riddled, self-confessedly silly and sloppy souls who give value or meaning to life." And that is the end of part 1 of the response, of the stimulus and response, chapter 13 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And I think that this is a particularly important section for a couple of reasons. One of the things she goes over, touches on again, is determinism and the possibility of creating disaster through determinism because of an erosion of responsibility, and that it goes ahead and that will result in atrocity after atrocity, or compliance after compliance, people going along with atrocities, in other words. So, and what else did she have in here? Well, that's going to have to do it for right now, I guess. But see tomorrow, another episode of Story Time. And until then, thank you very much and have a great day.